Good afternoon and welcome to Dia Chelsea. My name is Humberto Moro, I'm Deputy Director of Program.
And I'm Jordan Carter, Curator here at Dia.
And it's our pleasure to introduce today a conversation between artist Andrea Fraser and author Claudia Rankine. Andrea Fraser is widely regarded as one of the most influential and provocative artists of her generation. Since the mid-80s, her groundbreaking work in the field of institutional critique has investigated the social, financial, and affective economies of cultural organizations, fields, and groups. She has used performance, video, text, and a range of other forms to explore the motivations of artists, collectors, galleries, patrons, and art audiences, from financial investment to the pursuit of prestige, to sexual fantasy, to self-fulfillment. Combining the site-specific and research-based approaches of conceptualism with feminist investigations of subjectivity and desire, Fraser's work is infused with incisive analysis, humor, and pathos. Her work has been exhibited internationally in biennials like the Venice, Sao Paulo, Whitney, and Shanghai, and her solo exhibitions have been presented in institutions like the Hammer Museum in LA, the Art Institute in Chicago, the Whitney Museum of American Art, the MACBA in Barcelona, and MUAC in Mexico City, just to name a few. Fraser currently lives and works in Los Angeles, California, where she is a professor in the Department of Art at the University of California, Los Angeles.
Thank you. And Claudia Rankine is the author of 5 books of poetry, including Citizen in American Lyric and Don't Let Me Be Lonely in American Lyric, as well as 3 plays including Help, which premiered in March 2020 at the Shed, and The White Card, which premiered in February 2018, as well as numerous video collaborations. The recent collection of essays, Just Us, An American Conversation, was published by Graybluff Press in 2020. She is also the co-editor of several anthologies, including The Racial Imaginary, Writers on Race in the Life of the Mind. And in 2016, Rankine co-founded the Racial Imaginary Institute. Among her numerous awards and honors, Rankine is the recipient of the Bobbitt National Prize for Poetry, the Poets and Writers Jackson Poetry Prize, and myriad fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the Lannan Foundation, the MacArthur Foundation, United States Artists, and the National Endowment of the Arts. A former chancellor of the Academy of American Poets, Claudia Rankine joined the NYU Creative Writing Program in the fall of 2021, and she lives here in New York.
Before we pass it on to our guest, we want to thank Marian Goodman Gallery, especially Linda Pellegrini, Rose Lord, Jonathan Safdie, as we have collaborated to present this program in conjunction with Fraser's inaugural exhibition, which is on view until February 25th. Please check it out.
And we also want to give our immense thanks to Kim Golding and Max Tonone, as well as all of the Dia team who has made this program possible.
And now, without further ado, please help us in welcoming Andrea Fraser and Claudia Rankine.
Good afternoon. It's a real honor to be here with you. I was walking around the Hammer and encountered a piece of yours, and I actually did something I never do. I wrote to you and said, "Hey, lady." I just wanted to start by letting you know that this meeting is being recorded. Seriously, I wanted to begin with that piece. So we're going to show everyone, in case you haven't made it over to Marian Goodman Gallery, a small segment from the meeting is being recorded.
I just want to say that I'm really thrilled to be here with you, Claudia, and to thank Humberto and Jordan for bringing us here and hosting us, and to thank all of you for coming, and to say that it was so incredibly, wonderfully fortuitous that you happened to encounter this meeting as being recorded when it was on view at the Hammer, and I'm just wonderful to be here with you.
This meeting is being recorded.
Then I left myself not enough time before joining, so anxiety. No, I was just thinking too, just how much it changes the nature of the thing to have it be recorded. It's a whole other entity in the room. So certainly I feel some ambivalence about that. Yeah, I think of recording as the superego ear, or eyes. It's the judging gaze for me. Did you say Susan, she has a memorial service today? Yeah, she forgot it was a conflict, so she'll be late. Well, I feel like I've taken up the role this week of popping in and out, and I'm not sure what that role is about, but I'm curious about whether there's, something that's happening where one of us can't quite be here. And I do feel agitated and kind of disconnected. I'm bummed that Susan isn't here. In my experience of her last week was sort of fiery and upset, and it felt like we didn't quite have time to circle back to her upsettedness, so I was, hoping that she would be here. So a sense that we need fire in us and upsetness to start the work. It's something I'm having a hard time finding in myself. I guess I'm sort of joining in with a sense of agitation. I happened to do this anti-racism training yesterday, and then I was sort of reading the articles that you all had shared. And so I feel very much kind of caught up in these different perspectives, and still feel kind of clueless as to where I fall or what's right. Did you say coolness? Clueless, okay. Yeah, I connect my agitation to, I was at a talk on Friday, and there was a very fiery African-American woman there. And, I said something that must have been wrong, and really she went after me. And I don't know, I didn't know what to do with myself around it. And I've been thinking about it ever since and trying to calm myself down. And then I started thinking, so what are you doing in this group? You're just stirring it all up again. And yeah, this stuff is it's just hard stuff. And I feel like I am clueless in some ways, and scared to be that way, I think.
So there it is.
The first 4.5 minutes of a 99-minute piece.
Just so you have context. I also would like to thank Dia and Marian Goodman and everybody who's invisible to this moment. So thank you. I have some questions. I made a request that we concentrate on this piece because we don't have very much time. And it's a piece that is centered on group relations, which is a psychoanalytic practice or a therapy practice. Even that is where I want to begin. Where I would like us to start by asking you to tell us what this practice is.
Okay. Well, so what you just saw is the first 4.5 minutes of a 99-minute video that's based on transcripts and 9 hours of recordings and transcripts of 6 90-minute meetings of a group of 7 women that I convened, and I'm one of the 7 women. And we convened to take up the task of examining our internal racism and our roles in white supremacy, and specifically, so that's not specific enough, to apply group relations methods to that task. And so it sort of started out with those 2 kinds of components of a task, and all of the women, including myself in the group, are involved in group relations, so have kind of absorbed the theory and practice and methods of group relations, and this is one of the things that we were trying to apply, although in a very experimental way. But group relations is a experiential learning practice for learning about the unconscious dynamics in groups and organizations. And it was developed in the 1950s in the UK out of a kind of intersection of psychoanalysis, and largely Kleinian psychoanalysis, and systems theory, and then developed into a basic form, which is a kind of an experiential conference. And the small group is one of the forms of the experiential conference, and the task of small groups is to reflect in the here and now on unconscious dynamics within the group as they emerge. So it was that aspect of group relations practice that we were trying to apply to anti-racism work.
And it was a room of white women or white presenting women, yes?
Yeah, it was, I would say, self-identified white and self-identified female people. And the meetings were actually on Zoom, so it wasn't a room in this case. So we were meeting on Zoom, and the Zoom meetings were recorded, and then I used this meeting is being recorded.
Well, you have said that you don't like the word character, and instead wish to talk about the appropriation of position, functions, and roles within your subjects. So how did you get, one of the things that is noted when you watch a video is that the body language changes as the person you're embodying changes. So how did you get that from Zoom?
Well, so I edited the transcripts, and I did a paper edit, and then I edited the audio and the video to correspond to the paper edit. So I had an audio track. So the voices are very much, and the way I performed the voices are as close as I could get them to what I heard in the audio. But the gestures, and certainly the way I'm sitting, or the way people are sitting, is invented to a large extent.
So that's not, okay. It's a little hard because we have talked so much, so I'm trying to. But the question that I had for Andrea, which I think is the most important question I'll ask this afternoon, is what was the purpose of replicating a discussion among white women where they exhibit their defenses? Because for me, so much of your work has been around critiquing institutional practices. So as a Black woman, I could, in some way, look at white women as a kind of institution, and their practices as practices that have affected others across the board. So what do you think, in an ideal world, we could take from this?
Yeah, well, I can share my fantasy about what I thought could be taken from it. And, yeah, well, so part of the context for me of doing this work was, first of all, convening this group. And we didn't initially agree that I would be able to work with the material. So I wanted to convene the group to do this work, to do some work with these women. And the context for that was being a white woman in leadership roles. I was the chair of the art department at UCLA at the time, and being committed and wanting to take on anti-racism work within the department and to lead a plan to address anti-Black racism and white supremacy in the department, and feeling a lot of anxiety as I tried to step up to that. And having done anti-racism trainings that I think of as sort of political education oriented, and having done anti-bias trainings that I think of as a kind of cognitive behavioral, social psychology, self-monitoring practice, weren't helping me with that anxiety. And I wanted to understand what it was and to find ways to work through it. And so that's one of the reasons I turned to group relations as a psychodynamic practice that is concerned with, the unconscious psychological, emotional aspects of our behavior in groups and social systems, including white supremacy. And there has been a lot of work within group relations about social identity and race. And so I wanted to do that work, but why make it public, first of all? And there was a sense, well, there are a lot of women, a lot of white people trying to do this work. There were a lot of white affinity groups of various kinds that had emerged in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder. And it's like, okay, so we do this work and we do it in private, and we try to sort of deal with our shit, and then, we're gonna present our exemplary selves to the world, a very kind of closely monitored selves. And I saw that as another sort of defensive maneuver. And so how can we sort of own those parts? How can I as a white woman, and how can white people own these parts of themselves that they project in all sorts of ways onto people of color, while still keeping that hidden? So I thought it was something that it was important to show. And then, why perform all those women myself? Because I didn't want to turn it into a voyeuristic spectacle. And so performing all 7 women and performing to the camera puts the viewer into the group. And I think to some extent, or this was my hope, forecloses this position outside, which you've written about, and I would love to refer to some of, to your writing on whiteness, which has been so important. And, one of the sort of white defenses of displacing oneself, of taking up a position of, of woke or of informed, of educated, and using that as a kind of maneuver to step outside of that sort of position of privilege and step outside of a kind of ongoing self-examination, in the here and now. So I didn't want to let that position be available to the viewer. So that's one of the reasons that I felt like I needed to perform, all of the participants myself. And so, right, so what about that? What about, displaying those those defenses, and I do hope that there is some sense that there's also some working through of it, or some sort of development or transformation of at least some of those defenses, in the process of the piece, which covers all 6 of those meetings. And, that's debatable. But I do think that there's a, there's a benefit to sort of showing it and owning it, and in that, a potential for the viewer to kind of take that up, a potential specifically for white viewers to take that up. That maybe this is something that can be done and can be survived. And in that experience, again, of sort of white fragility and of working through white fragility, which we can talk more about too, that it sort of opens up a possibility, of taking up that kind of work, I guess.
Just to be clear, and because you have written so much about transactional relationships between the institution, between the donors, the collectors, the audience, everyone, what kind of agreement did you come to with the women?
So the first agreement was just to record, and everybody agreed to record, and I made transcripts and distributed them to the other members of the group. And the thinking was that we were generating research, that we were generating data that could be used for research in a range of ways. And actually at one point we turned it all over to a psychoanalyst to go through. And it was only after we finished the meetings that I drafted a second agreement and asked all of the women to give me permission to perform them and their words. And everyone did. And part of that agreement is that some of the proceeds from the work are divided among the group members.
I just want to make that clear. So nobody has secret thoughts. But now I'm going to go back, because this is the thing that really interests me. So much of racist behavior by all of us, and reactive behavior, we just had those policemen killing that black man. So we're all in this soup acting out inside the craziness of a country built on white supremacy. So I'm really interested for you to talk to us a little bit about something you referenced, this idea of diminishing defenses against the repressed, that the racism is in there. And the work like yours allows people to at least see and recognize a thing that they might hold or be pushing back or have in place defenses against.
Yeah, Claudia, one of the things that you've written so much about and explored is the sort of willful naivete and unknowing and ignorance of white people about race and about American history and about institutional racism, and how that's part of whiteness and also part of what reproduces white supremacy. And so the question of how one undoes that, sort of willful ignorance, is it willful? Willful on what level? I mean, where is the will? How do we understand that will? And how is that undone? I think is a really, really important question. And I feel like in a lot of anti-racism, work, the answer is political education. The answer is a kind of theoretical, intellectual, conscious process to undo the unknowing. And I don't have a lot of faith in that for a lot of reasons. And one of the reasons is I think there's a reenactment of a central aspect of white supremacy in that model, which is a kind of self-mastery. That we can sort of oh, we can master ourselves, we can master these parts of ourselves and control them and filter them. And that's so much a part of white supremacy. And so getting at, sort of turning to, to psychoanalysis as part of, sort of trying to employ a kind of more of a psychoanalytic strategy with regard to the repressed, where it's not about kind of forcibly sort of stripping away, repression and defenses to sort of expose, and that's the kind of fallacy of a kind of Marxist application of psychoanalysis as if it's some kind of ideology critique. That's not how psychoanalysis works. You have to diminish the defenses and the repression to let that knowledge sort of surface, so that knowledge surfaces. So the problem is really in some sense, in terms of the psychological dimensions of this, are the defenses, and that emerge, as shame, as guilt, that are activated by anxiety, that produce these forms of sort of projection, and persecutory anxieties, and excessive guilt, and also the defense of being exemplary. Which is one of my defenses that I kind of recognize as I was going through this, being exemplary as a performer, and sort of performing your ideal self as a way of sort of preserving that ideal self. And that's not a way of owning the parts of oneself that aren't ideal, which is, I think, the most important part of the process.
I was really, in the video, I was interested in those of you who might have seen it, and it was referred to in the 4 minutes that we saw. I think it's Susan who departed. And that, the space of departure in the video and the time it takes for the other women, white women in the room, to have to process this person leaving and then coming back. They returned to say they were going to leave. I think eventually that they would leave. This is going to sound odd, but from an artist's point of view, did you appreciate that, the dramatic, the drama of that?
I really tried to separate when I was in the group, to not think about the piece, but certainly when I was editing the material, I was very much thinking about the piece. But, so over the course of the meetings, at one point there was one woman who left and then came back, and then there was another woman who left permanently at a certain point. Yeah, there were two different people. And so in group relations terms, it's understood in terms of scapegoating, that was actually something the group was doing to those members, that we were using those members to hold parts of ourselves and parts of the group that we couldn't deal with. And those members were taking on that stuff and then were enacting, on behalf of the group, this expulsion. That's how it's understood in group relations terms. And it's a central mechanism because, it corresponds to a lot of racialized mechanisms of scapegoating, of incarceration, of creating borders and excluding, people. That is the mechanism of sort of taking parts of, say, specifically white identity groups that can't be kind of held or tolerated within those groups that threaten the coherence and the sort of sense of safety of white identity groups, and then, putting those into people of color. So we didn't have a person of color in the group to do that to. So we did it to other members of the group. And that's what was being enacted in a different form. And it played out according to the next most visible difference, which was age. And that became the primary struggle in the group, because that's where we could kind of locate the tensions and the hatreds of difference and the fear and the tensions around within, that were activated by the group.
But a black female was brought into the room, the fiery black woman who went after, who the person felt went after them. When Andrea told me we were using this piece, I was like, am I supposed to be that person?
I know, we were joking. It's like, you're the fiery black woman, I'm the frightened, weepy white woman. These are the roles that we...
So it is, so black people were brought into the room and utilized. They were just not functioning in that way. But this idea of leaving and coming back, I want to think about it a little bit in terms of in a kind of abstract way. And I said I wouldn't bring this up, but I'm going to bring it up. The fact that you didn't believe Trump could win the election. I know. I said I wouldn't do this, but it just occurred to me that when white people didn't believe, that's a kind of exit from the reality of the role of white supremacy and how it's working, that you can sort of step out to step back in. And that becomes that it doesn't have to be the physical movement. It's like a drop in cognitive apprehension of what is happening.
Yeah, there's there are a lot of different directions we could go from that. I'd rather not talk about Trump.
Yeah.
But the mechanism of avoidance and of self-segregation is very active in the group, and I think something that we return to, a number of times, and that is being a kind of primary manifestation of racism, particularly in liberal white people. There's a kind of an old psychoanalytic distinction made between dominative and aversive racism. Whereas dominative is this sort of projection of a kind of physical threat, a sort of persecutory anxiety. And then aversive or avoidant racism would be more associated with, northern white liberals, and this sort of, how that kind of produces these patterns of self-segregation and avoidance. And there was a question of whether the group itself was avoidant, and this is something that comes up in Just Us in a couple of different places, and that question, the basic question of the efficacy of white people trying to do anti-racist work on their own in these kinds of groups. And on the one hand, and this was part of our task, there's the logic of trying to spare people of color from the burden of education and potentially re-traumatization in that process. But then there's also the question, which you raise, of what the limits of what can be known and thought and understood within an all-white group and held. And what you mentioned of how black people, and specifically black women, were evoked by the group and still were serving as kind of these containers for projections outside of the group, that was still active. And that was the way that we could sort of manage to try to stay on our task, right, of examining racism. But when we pulled those projections back, that's when all hell broke loose in the group itself. And then we had to kind of try to work through that stuff. But then it looks like we're not talking about race anymore. So that was the kind of catch-22 of the process that was never, I think, really resolved at all.
How explicit was the group about, because when you introduced the group, you said 7 women. You didn't say 7 white women. So you did later, but not in the initial introduction. Whereas I always think of it as 7 white women. I can't take the white out of that. I remember when we talked about me coming to the group, and you were like, "But how can you come? Because you're not." Remember we talked about me coming to one of these groups, and you said, "What would be your role? Because you're not."
Yeah, that was a group that you were thinking of convening.
Yeah, a group, yeah. But yeah.
And I asked you, and you would be the only black woman.
Exactly.
I wondered about what that role would be.
Yeah, and how that would function. So whiteness was part of the conception of this, and so I wonder how much pressure was put on white femininity. I know that in the group relations, people are reacting to each other and to what was said, but I don't remember an active investigation of the actual terminology.
Yeah, I think that's right. I don't think we ever went there. Yeah, well.
And is that because it's not a category that you think of as a category?
Well, there is a section there. We did talk about whiteness. If that's what you're wondering about, yeah.
But white femininity specifically.
Well, there's at different points in the course of the 6 meetings, we talked about whiteness, and we kind of shared aspects of our sort of biographies and how we kind of came to be white, or how we understood our whiteness more specifically. And then I have some of that in the piece, and there's a section
where you
on
talk
whiteness.
about yourself, actually. Yeah.
I talk about myself. What kind of emerges there is I'm fighting my projections of whiteness going to the 2 of you. And then someone says, "Well, I'm curious what your fantasies are about that." And I say, "Well, I think it's in hair color." They were the 2 blondest women in the group. And then, that gets taken up. And then I kind of get identified as half Puerto Rican in this question of whether I'm white, which to me was kind of absurd because I'm white. And then there's a Jewish member in the group. And so kind of reflecting on that. So, that's how we were working, or trying to work with aspects of the kind of category of whiteness and look at that. But then what happens is that then that becomes part of it. It's about then excavating differences within the group and how there's a kind of othering going on in this group, even though it's ostensibly a homogenous group in terms of, race, gender.
Were there trust issues in the group?
Sure. I think there are trust issues.
Always, but...
yeah, and I think there was... at one point it emerged that there was a fantasy, which I'm not saying... To call it a fantasy is not to say it's not true. It's to say that it exists in the mind in a certain way. There was a fantasy that I wasn't white, and I was using all the other members as white people and manipulating the situation to do this piece, right? I think that's a fantasy that exists around the piece, and sort of to acknowledge that. And certainly that was something that I was fighting, and I also certainly don't see self as non-white. But it was interesting how, it's a kind of an example of sort of paranoid formations, I would say, around, that get racialized, of how, sort of paranoid fantasies get racialized. That's one of the ways I would talk about that, yeah.
I think we're approaching...
Wow.
Yeah? Oh, yeah. I have one last... Speaking of fantasies, are there I don't want to say theoretical, but are there follow-up pieces that will, they don't have to happen, but the thing I liked about this piece was that it offered no conclusion, no resolution, no it was in the process. You had to take it in and do what you will with that. And if your own defenses says, you know, I need to shut this down, you came up with vocabulary around that. If you are willing to leave it open and walk with it, it will talk to you over time. But having done it, I just wondered, is there another formation that you have been thinking about relative to critiquing either whiteness or white supremacy or white femininity?
Well, there's an essay I need to write, I think, you know, about what I feel like I learned in the process. And see, here's the weepy white woman. And there are, I mean, I'm sort of looking forward to, I mean, there was what I thought might be my next project might sort of bring this material together with other themes that I've been working on for a long time, you know, like museum education, and to sort of take this back to, for example, the docent, and sort of look at the docent again. I mean, I sort of did that, parts of that, in another piece from the early 90s that's in the show called Welcome to the Wadsworth. But to come and to go back to that from the position of what I feel like I know now, and so I think that's something that I want to do and I need to do.
And is that a critique of the positionality of the speaker in the earlier piece, the docent?
Yeah, I mean, Welcome to the Wadsworth is sort of it's a performance that, I go around the Wadsworth Atheneum. It's a museum in Hartford, Connecticut. It's the oldest continuously operating art museum in the United States. And, you know, and it's in some sense a sort of very much an institutionalization of kind of white Yankee colonial settler, you know, history and identity. And so the performance is sort of starting out as a kind of myself, actually, and then sort of being interpolated by the institution in a certain sense and becoming the subject that it produces, which is a subject, a white subject of white flight and home rule and anti-segregation in what was then the most racially and economically segregated urban area in the United States. So it wasn't, though, I mean, it wasn't so directly an examination of, it was very much outside of the institution. You know, I mean, I think that's kind of part of it, between the museum and the city. Okay. It didn't kind of go into the institution in the way that some of my other work has.
Mm-hmm. The more recent work. Okay, so thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
We have time for a few questions.
Thank you very much. That was wonderful, and the piece is absolutely fantastic. But Andrea, I had a question for you. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the 7.5 hours of material that isn't in the piece, and why some of it might have been left out or all of it, and wondering if in some ideal world where you had infinite stamina and your audience had infinite stamina, would you be tempted to pull a Warhol and just do the whole 9 hours? Is that a possibility?
Oh God, no, just kill me. Yeah, It was hard. It was hard for me to edit it down, actually. And when you start that kind of process and of sort of taking away, it's a bad process because it's really hard. I mean, mostly the video unfolds. Everything is more or less in the order. There are a few things that got moved around and got condensed. Yeah, I mean, the other 7.5 hours, there's stuff that's just too personal, in a way, that's too specific, I think, to that particular group. I mean, that has to do with, group relations, community stuff, group relations institution. There's stuff that I couldn't bear, hardly to listen to or transcribe or deal with. So there's that. So, I mean, yeah, there's a lot of editing. There's a lot that's edited out. I can't, there's only a couple of instances where I was conscious of something like sort of censorship in the process. So, yeah. But, well, I need to get back to the group. And I mean, I said, the group, we went through it and we anonymized it together. And we did turn the entire 62,000 word transcript over to a psychoanalyst to comment on for a panel discussion that a few of us participated in, and this was in a group relations context. So it's it's data, and it's research that, it's data that I think could be available for further research, not necessarily as a performance, but maybe in other forms.
Could I ask you both to maybe say something about your sense of the virtuosity of the performance? And are we to take it sort of as transparent or as an object in the work? Because it's such an extraordinary performance.
Yeah, I mean, that worries me when people start talking about the performance, because I have had the experience often of, showing the piece and people kind of go on about the performance and they're not talking about what the performance is about. And it feels like a kind of way of avoiding what the performance is about. And I wonder about that, and I wonder about the structure of that it's not just a sort of, because I don't think that defense would be activated if it wasn't in the work, right? And if it wasn't in my own relationship to the performance. And of course it is, because I have as much as is exposed of my own stuff, as well as the other women's stuff in this, it's, of course, minutely, filtered. And, I mean, I think that this is true generally of art, that artists might expose all sorts of things, but we do it within this highly crafted and conceptualized frame that is itself a kind of, it's a defense, but it's a defense against what's shameful in exposure. And so, the link there has to do with narcissism. And, the narcissism, and it's that we were examining of white narcissism, its relationship, to privilege, to meritocracy, to one's ideal self, omnipotence, and, all these kinds of aspects of white narcissism, and narcissistic vulnerability, which is how I understand white fragility, right? And there is something invulnerable about the performance itself, in its, virtuosity, or in the mastery that I tried to conjure, right? But the other side of that is that it's a bribe, which is how Freud understood the aesthetic to a large extent. That the aesthetic is a kind of bribe for the viewer, like a joke, to get past the repression or to get past the defense. It's a sort of workaround. And it's like, well, if it wasn't a good performance, no one is going to watch this thing, It's like, so, but I'm really curious.
I agree with you that it's a direction that takes it somewhere else, though it is a nod to your brilliance, so congratulations on that. But as you were speaking, I was thinking, I'm wondering, what does it do to the gallery space that it is in it? Given that so much of your work is about the relationship between the institution and the work and the audience and what the work serves. So what does it do to that space?
Well, wasn't thinking about this, but the architecture of the gallery, there's the front gallery that's you first enter when you come out of the elevator. And then there's the other gallery. And to get to the other gallery, you have to walk through this long corridor where there are offices. And I didn't think about this, but it becomes like this HR space, in the back. And I thought, wow, that's just perfect. But, I think I finally worked out the installation that it's not in a black room. It's not in a black box. I want it to be in the real sight of the space. I want the space to be seen and to be visible, and I don't want to take the viewer out of that space. So I do want it to be rooted in the, in the here and now of the viewing of it, which is the gallery space.
Andrea, you might have to write your paper to answer this question, but as a follow-up to one of Claudia's last questions, I wanted to ask you if you can perhaps share some thoughts about what you think you might have learned in the process of making this piece.
A lot. A lot of what I learned was quite personal about myself. So I don't think I really want to go there because I'm going to start crying. I don't want to be that person up here right now. What did I learn? Yeah. I think I'm a different person than I was when I embarked on this project. And there are a lot of different pieces to that. And I think, I could, kind of go through the video and point to moments that are in the piece where I think a number of the members were discovering something that they hadn't put together before. And this was after, in some cases, years of psychotherapy and psychoanalysis, but connections that were made that they hadn't made before. And I think that that's what needs to happen. And that's the sort of first step in kind of taking back projections of making those connections in the mind that are also affective, that they have an emotional charge. They're not just intellectual connections. So, yeah, I hope that is satisfactory as a response.
Lauren Ballant, who unfortunately passed away recently, she wrote a book that was published called The Inconvenience of Other People. And I think when we're in analysis, there's a kind of way in which the analyst is a non-person that, you've paid them to adjust to you, or not, or whatever they do. Whatever they're doing in there. But this thing of having real people that you're constantly having to hold or despise or judge or not judge means that you yourself have to be aware of where you're standing relative to them. And I can see how that would be work. We're all doing that kind of work all the time, but not so consciously.
So for me, one of the maybe the most important thing about your piece, which I think is really amazing, is the insistence on the necessity of psychoanalysis for dealing with racism. Like you said, Andrea, that you don't have much faith in political education. And it reminds me of Adorno saying the same exact thing about anti-Semitism in Germany after, in the 1950s, that it's doomed to failure, that kind of education approach, you know, meet real Jews and you'll see how good they are, that kind of thing. And he said, because it doesn't deal with the fact that the anti-Semite wants to be an anti-Semite. It doesn't deal with desire. And this is a roundabout way of getting to my question, which is that you gave the transcript to a psychoanalyst to read. And I'm wondering how much that psychoanalyst interpretation of the transcript affected what you ended up putting and emphasizing in the performance, in the piece.
I don't think it did, actually. Yeah, I don't think it really did very much. I mean, it was, unfortunately, she didn't have a whole lot of time to deal with it, but yeah.
The fantasy, what were you hoping?
Oh, that I would get from that? Oh, thank you for, leading me to... Yeah, I mean, I was hoping I would get, and this is my transference onto psychoanalysis, it's this sort of mommy, who's going to tell me that we did good work. That was my fantasy. That we did good work and that we were working through, and, And so, yeah, I mean, that's one of the fantasies one has to excavate oneself from. In analysis and in human, the course of human development.
Andrea, you were reaching for one of the books a number of times during the conversation, and I presume that I can't really see I presume one of them is just us. Do you feel like you would like to read what you were going to possibly read?
Well, there are different things that I was going to read at different points. So... when it's the first page of Just Us, of Claudia's book, where Claudia asked the question, how is a call to change named shame, named penance, named chastisement? What does one say? How does one say what if without reproach? And one of the things that I was hoping Claudia and I could sort of talk about was this sort of strategy, I think, in your book, or that I found in your book, that I do think kind of resonates with things that I attempt, which is, and how I think you succeed in making a call for change in Just Us, that doesn't feel like shame or penance or reproach. And I think a lot of that, in my experience of the book, has to do with the dialogue you have with yourself throughout the book. That it's about these conversations, these difficult and painful and violent conversations, with white people and also with friends. And so I experience myself in part as an object of that examination. But at the same time, you're also having a conversation with yourself throughout the book. And in that conversation with yourself, I think you model for me as a viewer a kind of reflexive engagement in a process and invite me in to join with you in that conversation, in that examination. And that's something that really resonated with me too, because I think it's one of the things that I try to do in my work. And it goes back to your first question of why show this, and it's a way, it's partly, but now I go back to the exemplary defense, but of to kind of model, to provide an example of a kind of reflexive work for the viewer in hopes that the viewer will take that up. So that's one of the things that I wanted to.
First of all, Andrea, I'm just so happy to be here. I wrote my thesis based on your work. And we've actually emailed before, but So my question is, I wonder how you see this piece, which is largely about race and group relations, like tie back into your previous work about sexuality and intimacy, because I noticed that the first time the word fantasy came up was during a question that was serious of like, where are you trying to get at? And then this subtle like sexual connotation was sort of introduced as a release to that tension. And I also noticed that there's some gestures in how you moved your leg in the video piece that is clearly kind of gendered. I guess it makes me wonder if it ever came up with the psychoanalyst or in your examination of your white femininity, because recently I've been thinking about why like fear and sexual desire are intertwined, and I can't help but wonder, but like all of the women that came before me probably went through some war relating to race and nationality segregation, and in those wars there were a lot of rape or sexual violence, and maybe they have developed this mechanism to make it easier to release the tension. And sorry, I just keep talking. So I wonder if you have thought about if that use of subtle sexuality is a reactive defense mechanism, or like what your thoughts on that is.
I don't really see much connection between this piece and the, I think probably the piece you're referring to, you're thinking about is Untitled. Except the fact of recording, right? So actually that's a pretty important connection, isn't it, right? Of sort of private acts that are being recorded and shown. Okay, that's a major connection. I guess I've been doing this for a while. But no, I mean, I don't know, did sexuality come up? It did come up. I mean, there was some discussion, of white women and black men, and a sort of sexualization of black men by white women, and the, the history of lynching of black men, with the rationale of, saving the honor of white women. And I didn't put that. That's one of the things that I didn't put in the piece for a range of reasons. But no, I mean, the fantasy now, the way that I suppose I'd say that the psychoanalytic framework that I'm more engaged with in some ways at the moment de-emphasizes, sexuality. Certainly desire and attachment are central, but sort of going back really to pre-Oedipal attachments and desires that are also pre-genital, in that sense. And yes, that's, I think, for me, from my perspective, is very, very active in the piece in terms of the intergenerational dynamics within the group that are fundamentally mother-daughter kind of Oedipal dynamics. So I don't know if that...
But the thing that struck me when the question was being asked had to do with, using the body as a primary medium of communication. And so the crossing of the legs, the uncrossing of the legs, the opening of the legs, bringing up the leg, the moving of the leg. Another way to think about it would be, and this is complete projection because it works for a frame that I could put it in, but this question that I had earlier about exiting or not exiting, that do we run? The flight or fright, or the more unconscious we get, I mean, the more things get expressed and the more agitated. I think that was the word that was being used. The question of do I leave? Do I stay? Do I leave? Do I stay? Do I have to put up with this? And so the movement of the leg might not go in the direction of desire and trauma, racial. I think rape was mentioned, but it might go in the direction of flight because of the question of this uncomfortability of the whole endeavor on every level. And I think we're going to end there.
Good place to end.